"Give me a son, and I'll give you a fortune." Billionaire shocked when she had twins. Hello, let's start another beautiful story. Welcome to my channel. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Let's go. The autumn. Wind whispered through the streets of Manhattan, carrying with it the scent of impending rain and desperation. Inside Carter's Soul Kitchen, Ava wiped her hands on her apron and stared at the stack of bills scattered across the restaurant's worn wooden counter. The late afternoon sun filtered through the restaurant's front windows, casting long shadows across the empty tables that should have been filled with the warmth and laughter of customers enjoying her grandmother's recipes. Her fingers traced the embossed lettering on one of the final notices. 3 days. That's all the time she had left before the bank would seize everything her grandmother had spent a lifetime building. The thought made her chest tighten, a familiar ache that had become her constant companion over the past few months. "Baby girl, you can't keep staring at those papers like they're going to change their numbers," Ruby, her head waitress of 15 years, said from behind the counter. The older woman's face was etched with concern as she approached, her comfortable shoes squeaking against the recently mopped floor. Ava managed a weak smile. "I know, Ruby. She gestured helplessly at the mounting bills. Grandma rose. "Never prepared me for this part. She taught me every recipe, every secret ingredient, but dealing with predatory loans and rising property taxes, that wasn't part of her legacy." The restaurant had been her grandmother's dream, a piece of their family's soul poured into every dish that left the kitchen. Rose Carter had started with nothing but determination and a handful of family recipes, building Carter's Soul Kitchen into a neighborhood institution. For 30 years, it had been more than just a restaurant. It was a sanctuary where people came not just to eat, but to feel at home. "Your grandmother would be proud of how hard you're fighting," Ruby said, placing a weathered hand over Ava's. "But she'd also tell you to know when to ask for help." Ava pulled her hand away, straightening her spine. "I've asked for help, Ruby. Every bank in the city has turned me down. Even with our history, our reputation, they took one look at our books and showed me the door." She didn't mention the way some of those bankers had looked at her, their eyes dismissing her before she'd even opened her mouth. A young black woman trying to save a failing restaurant in a rapidly gentrifying neighborhood. She could practically hear their thoughts. The bell above the door chimed, and both women turned. A delivery man stood there, holding yet another envelope. Ava's heart sank. She knew what it was before he even asked for her signature. Another notice, another deadline, another nail in the coffin of her grandmother's dream. After signing for the envelope, Ava retreated to the kitchen, her sanctuary. The familiar sense of herbs and spices enveloped her as she leaned against the industrial refrigerator. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory. "The kitchen is where magic happens, baby. No matter how bad things get out there, in here, you can always create something beautiful." She pulled out her phone, checking the restaurant's account. Balance for the 100th time that day. The numbers hadn't magically improved. Even with the lunch rush they'd had earlier, their best in weeks, they were still hemorrhaging money. The property taxes had tripled in the last year alone, and the repairs the building needed. A knock on the kitchen door interrupted her thoughts. Ruby stood there holding her tablet. "Ava, honey, you need to see this." Her voice trembled slightly, which was enough to make Ava's stomach clench. Ruby had weathered every storm with them. Nothing rattled her. The tablet showed a news article from that morning. Montgomery Real Estate Group announces major development project in Harlem. The accompanying photo showed George Montgomery, heir to the Montgomery Empire, standing in front of a model of what looked like luxury condominiums. Ava's eyes fixed on his face, sharp features, expensive suit, and an expression that suggested he'd never heard the word no in his life. They're buying up everything in a 5-block radius, Ruby said quietly. Word is they're not even negotiating anymore. Just throwing money at property owners until they cave. Ava's fingers tightened on the tablet. She knew what this meant. Their neighborhood was the latest target for urban renewal, a pretty term for pushing out small business owners and families who'd been there for generations. She'd seen it happen before, watched other family businesses disappear one by one, replaced by chain stores and overpriced coffee shops. "We're not selling," Ava declared, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "This place isn't just a building or a business. It's my grandmother's legacy, our family's history, our community's heart." Ruby's expression was gentle but worried. "I know, baby, but sometimes..." "No." Ava cut her off, pulling her grandmother's old recipe book from its special shelf. The leather-bound volume was worn, its pages stained with decades of love and use. Grandma Rose always said that when times get tough, you go back to your roots, so that's what we're going to do. She opened the book to her grandmother's signature dish, Rose's Miracle Workers, the cornbread muffins that had put Carter's Zoll Kitchen on the map 30 years ago. "We're having a special tonight, half price on all of Grandma's classics. Send out the word on social media, call our regulars, we're not going down without a fight." As Ruby hurried to spread the word, Ava began gathering ingredients, her movements, precise and determined. She refused to let this be the end of their story. Somewhere out there was a solution, a way to save everything her grandmother had built. She just had to find it before time ran out. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that fate had already set in motion a chain of events that would change everything. In a sleek office tower across town, George Montgomery was about to make a decision that would collide their worlds in ways neither of them could imagine. The rain finally began to fall outside, drumming against the kitchen's small windows. Ava worked through the afternoon, her grandmother's recipes flowing through her hands like prayers, each dish a defiant statement. "We are still here. We matter. We survive." Little did she know, survival would soon take on a whole new meaning, and the price of keeping her grandmother's dream alive would be higher than she could have ever imagined. George Montgomery stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse office, watching the rain wash over Manhattan. 50 stories below, people scurried like ants, their umbrellas forming a shifting mosaic of colors against the gray sidewalks. His reflection stared back at him. Immaculate suit, perfectly styled hair, the very image of success. And yet, the letter on his desk threatened to unravel everything. "Your grandfather's will is quite explicit, Mr. Montgomery." Lawrence Chen, the family's longtime attorney, sat in one of the leather chairs across from George's desk, his voice carrying the weight of decades of legal experience. "The controlling interest in Montgomery Holdings can only pass to you if you have a legitimate heir by your 45th birthday." George's jaw tightened. "And how long did you know about this clause, Lawrence?" "It was revealed to me this morning when the sealed addendum was opened, as per your grandfather's instructions." Lawrence adjusted his glasses, a habit George had come to recognize as discomfort. "You have 8 months." The weight of those words settled in George's stomach like lead. 8 months to produce an heir or watch control of his family's empire slip through his fingers, his grandfather's final power play from beyond the grave. "Victoria must be thrilled," George said, naming his stepmother. The woman who'd married his grandfather in his final years and had been circling like a vulture ever since, waiting for any opportunity to sink her claws deeper into the family fortune. Lawrence's silence was answer enough. Of course Victoria knew. She'd probably helped craft this trap. If George failed to meet the conditions, she'd be perfectly positioned to take control through her own son, a teenage boy who'd never worked a day in his life. "We can challenge it," Lawrence offered, though his tone suggested he already knew George's answer. And spend years in litigation while Victoria uses it to undermine confidence in my leadership? George shook his head. The board would replace me before the first hearing. He returned to his desk, picking up the morning's property acquisitions report. The Harlem Development Project stared back at him, his vision for transforming an aging neighborhood into a modern urban paradise. It was more than just another real estate deal. It was his chance to prove he was more than just his grandfather's heir. There are services, Lawrence began delicately, agencies that specialize in arranging— No, George cut him off. Whatever we do has to be legitimate. No shortcuts, no scandals. One whiff of impropriety and Victoria will pounce. A knock at the door interrupted them. George's assistant, Patricia, entered with a stack of folders. The updated reports on the holdouts in Harlem, Mr. Montgomery and Mrs. Montgomery, Victoria, called again about the charity gala next week. George waved away the mention of Victoria. The holdouts? Most have accepted our offers, but there are 3 remaining properties. Patricia laid out photos on his desk. The Wilson family's hardware store, the old Church Street Theater, and she hesitated before placing the last photo down. Carter's Soul Kitchen. George picked up the photo of the restaurant. The building was old but well-maintained, with warm light spilling from its windows onto the rain-slicked street. A young woman stood in the doorway, her expression determined as she spoke to what appeared to be a reporter. "The owner?" he asked, something about the woman's fierce stance catching his attention. "Ava Carter," Patricia replied, pulling out a detailed report. "Inherited the business from her grandmother last year. She's declined all our offers, despite significant financial difficulties. The restaurant's been a neighborhood institution for 3 decades. George studied the photo more closely. There was something compelling about Ava Carter's face, a strength that reminded him of his own mother before illness and his father's betrayals had worn her down. Financial difficulties? Substantial. Patricia's efficiency was, as always, impeccable. They're 3 months behind on their property taxes. The bank is moving to foreclose. Our analysts give them less than a week before they're forced to sell. Lawrence, who had been quietly observing, cleared his throat. "George, perhaps we should focus on the more pressing matter of the will." "I am focusing on it." George's mind was already racing, pieces falling into place. "Patricia, get me everything you can on Ava Carter, full background check, and move my afternoon appointments. I'll be making a visit to Harlem." After his assistant left, Lawrence leaned forward. "What are you planning?" George's lips curved into a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "A solution to both problems. This Ava Carter needs money to save her restaurant. I need an heir without complications. A business arrangement. Nothing more." "You can't be serious." Lawrence's normally composed face showed genuine alarm. "The risks are considerably less than letting Victoria take control." George stood, straightening his cuffs. "Draw up the contracts, make them ironclad. I want everything covered. Custody arrangements, financial terms, confidentiality. No room for future claims or emotional entanglements." "And you think she'll agree?" George looked again at the photo of Ava Carter, at the fierce pride in her stance, despite the obvious weight on her shoulders. "Everyone has a price, Lawrence. Even pride can be bought when survival is at stake." As his car wound through the rain-soaked streets toward Harlem later that afternoon, George tried to ignore the voice in his head that sounded suspiciously like his mother's. "Some things shouldn't be for sale, George," she used to say. But his mother had died believing in love and loyalty, and look where that had gotten her. No, this was business. Clean, simple, transactional. He would offer Ava Carter a way to save her grandmother's legacy, and in return, she would help him secure his. 8 months to produce an heir, to outmaneuver Victoria, to ensure the Montgomery Empire remained under his control. What could possibly go wrong? The car pulled up outside Carter's Soul Kitchen just as the evening crowd was beginning to arrive. Through the windows, George could see Ava Carter moving among the tables, her smile warm and genuine as she greeted her customers. For a moment, something like doubt flickered in his chest. Then he remembered Victoria's smirking face, the weight of his grandfather's conditions, the empire he'd spent his life preparing to lead. He stepped out into the rain, straightened his tie, and walked toward the restaurant's door. It was time to make a deal. The dinner rush at Carter's Soul Kitchen was in full swing when George Montgomery walked through the door. The warmth hit him first, not just the temperature, but the atmosphere itself. The air was rich with the aroma of cornbread and slow-cooked meats, and the sound of genuine laughter mixed with the clink of cutlery against plates. It was nothing like the sterile, expensive restaurants he frequented where people came to be seen rather than to eat. Ava noticed him immediately. How could she not? His tailored charcoal suit probably cost more than her monthly revenue, and he stood in her doorway like he already owned the place. Which, she realized with a sinking feeling, he was probably here to arrange. "Welcome to Carter's," she said, approaching him with practiced professionalism. "Table for one." His eyes met hers, sharp and assessing. "Actually, Ms. Carter, I was hoping we could speak privately. George Montgomery." He extended his hand, but Ava didn't take it. "I know who you are, Mr. Montgomery, and I know why you're here." She gestured to the packed dining room. "As you can see, we're quite busy. If you'd like to make an offer on my restaurant, you can contact our lawyer." A hint of amusement flickered across his face. "Your lawyer? The one you can no longer afford to pay?" He lowered his voice. "Or should we discuss the foreclosure notice you received this morning?" Ava felt the blood drain from her face. Ruby appeared at her side, sensing trouble. "Everything okay, baby girl?" "It's fine, Ruby." Ava straightened her spine, meeting George's gaze. "Mr. Montgomery was just leaving." "Actually," George said, "I'm here to help you save this place." The words hung in the air between them. Ava's instincts screamed that nothing good could come from this, but the weight of those unpaid bills pressed against her conscience. "My office. 5 minutes." She led him through the busy kitchen, past the curious glances of her staff, to the small room that had once been her grandmother's sanctuary. Rose Carter's presence still lingered here, in the old photos on the walls, in the handwritten recipes framed above the desk, in the worn leather chair where she'd taught Ava everything. She knew about running a restaurant. George Montgomery looked absurdly out of place in the cramped space, like a wolf in a henhouse. He declined her gesture to sit, choosing instead to examine the photos on the wall. "Your grandmother?" he asked, indicating a picture of Rose in her younger days, standing proudly in front of the newly opened restaurant. "Yes." Ava remained, standing as well, arms crossed. "Now what's this about saving my restaurant?" George turned to face her, his expression unreadable. "I'm prepared to clear all your debts, pay off the bank, cover the back taxes, even provide capital for renovations." Ava's heart skipped a beat, but she kept her voice steady. "And in return, you want the building?" "No." His answer surprised her. "In return, I want you to have my child." The words didn't register at first. Surely she'd misheard him. But George, Montgomery's face remained serious, his eyes fixed on hers as if gauging her reaction. "Excuse me?" Her voice came out as a whisper. "It's a straightforward business proposition," he continued, as if he were discussing a merger rather than suggesting something that made her head spin. "I need an heir within 8 months to retain control of my company. You need money to save this restaurant. We can help each other." Ava's laugh was sharp and disbelieving. "You're insane." "I'm practical." He pulled a folder from his briefcase. The arrangement would be completely legal. You'd be well compensated, not just for the pregnancy, but for your discretion. The child would be raised as a Montgomery with all the advantages that entails, but you'd maintain visitation rights. "Get out!" Ava's voice shook with rage. "Get out of my restaurant! The bank gives you what, 3 days?" His tone remained maddeningly calm. "And then what happens to your grandmother's legacy? To the people who depend on this place for their livelihood?" The mention of her staff cut deep. Ruby had 2 kids in college. Their chef, Antonio, was supporting his elderly parents. The busboys were working their way through school. "This isn't just about money for you," George continued, watching her closely. "It's about family, community, tradition. I'm offering you a way to preserve all of that by selling myself." The words tasted bitter in her mouth. "By making a choice." He placed the folder on her desk. "Everything's outlined here. Financial terms, medical care, living arrangements during the pregnancy. Take 24 hours to think it over." "I don't need 24 hours to tell you you're out of your mind." George moved to the door, then paused. "You know what happens to neighborhoods like this when they're redeveloped, Ms. Carter. First, the small businesses go. Then the families who've lived here for generations can't afford the new property taxes. Within a year, the heart of the community is gone." His eyes met hers. "You can't stop progress, but you can preserve what matters most." He left her standing there, the folder on her desk like a bomb waiting to explode. Through her office window, she could see her dining room full of familiar faces, neighbors who'd watched her grow up, families celebrating special occasions, elderly couples who'd been coming here since her grandmother first opened the doors. The foreclosure notice sat in her drawer, its deadline looming. 3 days to save everything her grandmother had built. 3 days to decide if she was willing to pay the price George Montgomery was offering. Ava sank into her grandmother's old chair, buried her face in her hands, and tried to imagine what Rose would say if she could see her now. But for the first time since her grandmother's death, the answer didn't come. Outside her office, the sounds of the restaurant continued. Laughter, conversation, the rhythm of lives intertwined with her own. Everything she stood to lose. Everything she might save, depending on the choice she made. The folder sat untouched on her desk, waiting for her decision. Sleep eluded Ava that night. She sat at her kitchen table until dawn. George Montgomery's folder opened before her, its contents blurring as she read them over and over. The numbers were staggering, enough money to not only save the restaurant, but transform it with plenty, left over to secure her family's future for generations. The morning light was just beginning to paint her apartment walls when her phone buzzed. Ruby's name flashed on the screen. "Turn on channel 7, Ruby said without preamble. Now, Ava fumbled for her remote, and there it was, Carter's Soul Kitchen, featured in a morning news segment about local businesses facing displacement. The reporter stood outside her restaurant, speaking solemnly about the changing face of Harlem, while B-roll footage showed their regular customers sharing memories of the place. "They interviewed me yesterday," Ruby's voice cracked. "Asked what I'd do if the place closed. 30 years I've worked there, Ava. 30 years. Ava's throat tightened. "Ruby, I'm not trying to guilt you, baby girl. Lord knows you've done everything possible to keep us afloat. Ruby paused. "I just needed you to see what we're all about to lose." After hanging up, Ava dressed mechanically and walked the 6 blocks to the restaurant. The morning was crisp, autumn leaves crunching under her feet as she passed. Familiar storefronts. Old Mr. Chen was already setting up his fruit stand, carefully arranging peaches that her grandmother used to say were the secret to her famous cobbler. He waved, and she wondered if he knew his tiny shop was probably on Montgomery's acquisition list too. She unlocked the restaurant's door, breathing in the lingering sense of last night's service. Her grandmother's presence felt especially strong this morning. Ava could almost hear her voice, Sometimes the right choice is the hardest one, baby. That's how you know it matters. The sound of a car pulling up outside broke her reverie. Through the window, she watched an expensive black sedan stop in front of the restaurant. Her heart skipped a beat, expecting George Montgomery, but instead a woman emerged, elegant, probably in her 50s, wearing designer clothes that made Ava think of old money and country clubs. The bell chimed as the woman entered. "We're closed," Ava called out automatically. "Oh, I know." The woman's smile didn't reach her eyes. "I'm Victoria Montgomery. I believe you met my stepson yesterday." Ava's guard immediately went up. Something in Victoria's perfectly practiced expression set off warning bells. The restaurant's still not for sale. "No." Victoria moved through the dining room, running, a manicured finger along one of the tables. "That's not what I heard. In fact, I heard George made you quite an unusual offer." Ice formed in Ava's stomach. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please." Victoria's laugh was soft and cutting. "George may think he's being clever, but he forgets. I've been playing this game since before he was born." She opened her designer purse, withdrew a check, and placed it on the nearest table. "Triple whatever he offered you. Walk away now, sell us the property, and we'll call it a day." Ava glanced at the check, then back at Victoria. "Why do you care?" "Because I know my stepson. This little scheme of his. It's not just about an heir. It's about proving he can beat me at my own game." Victoria's smile turned sharp. "But he's not the only one who can make offers, dear. Think about it. No pregnancy, no complications. Just take the money and start fresh somewhere else. Get out." Ava's voice was quiet but firm. "Don't be foolish." Victoria's mask slipped, just for a moment, revealing something harder underneath. "Do you really think someone like George Montgomery would ever see you as anything more than a transaction? This isn't Pretty Woman, dear. There's no fairy tale ending here." "I said get out." Victoria shrugged, leaving the check on the table. "The offer stands until noon. After that?" She glanced around the restaurant. "Well, I'm sure this place will make lovely condominiums." After she left, Ava sank into a chair, her hands shaking. Victoria's words had struck deeper than she wanted to admit. She wasn't naive. She knew exactly what George's offer meant, how people would see her if they knew. A woman selling her body, her future, her dignity for money. But Victoria's visit had clarified something else. This wasn't just about saving the restaurant anymore. Whatever game the Montgomerys were playing, she refused to be just another pawn. Her phone buzzed again, a text from the bank. Her last extension request had been denied. The foreclosure would proceed as scheduled. Ava stood, walked to her office, and picked up George's folder. She'd been looking at it all wrong. This wasn't about selling herself. It was about taking control of her destiny. If she was going to make a deal with the devil, she'd do it on her own terms. She called. The number George had left. His assistant answered on the first ring. "Tell Mr. Montgomery I want to meet," Ava said, surprising herself with how steady her voice sounded. "But not at his office. Here, at the restaurant after closing. And tell him to bring his lawyer. I have some conditions of my own." She hung up before she could change her mind. Walking to her grandmother's old photo, she touched the glass gently. "I hope you understand, Grandma Rose. Sometimes keeping a dream alive means waking up to reality." The rest of the day passed in a blur. She worked alongside her staff, cooked her grandmother's recipes, served her customers, all while carrying the weight of what she was about to do. Each familiar face, each story shared across her tables, each laugh echoing through her dining room reminded her why she had to fight. As the last customer left and Ruby turned the sign to closed, Ava began preparing for a very different kind of service. She set a single table, brought out her grandmother's best tablecloth, and waited for the man who was about to change her life forever. The bell chimed at exactly 9 o'clock. George Montgomery entered, followed by his lawyer, both carrying leather briefcases that probably cost more than her monthly rent. "Miss Carter," George said, his expression unreadable. "You had some conditions to discuss?" Ava gestured to the table she'd prepared. "Sit down, Mr. Montgomery. Before we talk business, you're going to try my grandmother's cooking. If you're going to be the father of my child, you should at least know what legacy you're really buying into." Something flickered in George's eyes. Surprise, maybe even respect. He sat down, and Ava disappeared into her kitchen. Her hands moved automatically, preparing the dishes that had sustained her community for generations. Each ingredient was a prayer, each recipe a promise. She was about to change everything, but first, she would make him understand exactly what he was getting himself into. The scent of Rose Carter's famous gumbo filled the restaurant as Ava placed the steaming bowl in front of George Montgomery. His lawyer, Lawrence, eyed the dish with poorly concealed interest, his notepad temporarily forgotten. "My grandmother always said you can tell everything you need to know about a person by how they approach their food," Ava said, settling into her chair across from them. She'd changed from her chef's whites into a simple black dress, determined to face this negotiation as an equal, not a supplicant. George studied the bowl before him, steam rising in the dim restaurant lighting. "And what exactly are you hoping to learn about me, Miss Carter? Whether you can appreciate something's true value, not just its price tag." A slight smile tugged at his lips as he picked up his spoon. The first taste seemed to surprise him. His eyes widened slightly, and something in his rigid posture softened. He took another spoonful, more deliberately this time. "This is extraordinary," he admitted. "That's what 30 years of perfecting a recipe does." Ava leaned forward. "Now imagine having to watch that legacy disappear because some corporation decided our neighborhood needed another chain restaurant." George set down his spoon. "I understand you have conditions." "Yes." Ava pulled out her own folder, not leather like theirs, but a simple manila envelope. "First, the restaurant stays exactly as it is. No renovations, no modernizing, no changing the menu or the staff. This place remains under my complete control." Lawrence began to object, but George held up a hand, motioning for her to continue. "Second," Ava went on, "I want a separate agreement for the child. The money for the restaurant is one thing, but I won't have our child's future tied to a business deal. They deserve better than that." "Our child?" George's emphasis on the word made her chin lift. "Yes, our child, because that's my third condition. You will be involved. Not just financially, not just on paper. If we're doing this, you're going to be a real father. No hiding behind nannies or shipping them off to boarding school. This child will know both their parents." George's expression remained carefully neutral, but something flickered in his eyes. That could complicate things. "Life is complicated, Mr. Montgomery. Children even more so." Ava pushed her grandmother's bread pudding toward him. The second course of her carefully planned meal. "You want an heir? Fine, but you're getting a child, a human being with needs and feelings? I need to know you understand that." As if to emphasize her point, laughter drifted in from the street, a family passing by, a father swinging his young daughter while her mother watched, smiling. The simple scene hung between them like a question. Lawrence cleared his throat. "Perhaps we should review the specific terms." "Not yet." George surprised them both by taking a bite of the bread pudding. His eyes closed briefly, and Ava saw something pass across his face, a memory, perhaps, or a ghost of one. When he opened them again, his gaze was different. "Tell me about your grandmother, Miss Carter." The request caught her off guard. "What? The woman who created these recipes, who built this place. Tell me about her." Ava hesitated, then found herself speaking, the words flowing like her grandmother's recipes. She told him about Rose Carter's early days, working 3 jobs to save. money for the restaurant, about the community that rallied around her, helping with everything from painting walls to taste-testing new dishes. About the nights Rose would stay open late, feeding anyone who was hungry, keeping a tab that she never really expected to be paid. As she spoke, George continued eating, his attention focused entirely on her words. Even Lawrence set aside his legal pad, drawn into the story of a woman who'd built something precious from nothing but determination and love. "She sounds remarkable," George said finally, his voice softer than Ava had heard it before. She was. Ava stood, clearing their plates with the efficiency of long practice. "Which is why I need to know. Why an heir? Why not just find someone to marry, have a child the traditional way?" George's jaw tightened. "Marriage complicates things. More than paying a stranger to have your child. At least this way, the terms are clear." He straightened his tie, armor sliding back into place. No emotional entanglements, no messy divorces, no fighting over assets. Ava brought out coffee, rich and dark, another of her grandmother's recipes. "Sounds lonely. Sounds practical." But he wouldn't meet her eyes as he said it. They spent the next hour going through the contracts, Lawrence making notes as Ava outlined her requirements. The restaurant would receive immediate funding, with additional capital held in trust. The child would have their own trust fund, separate from any business considerations, and most importantly, both parents would have equal say in major decisions regarding their child's upbringing. "There's one more thing," Ava said, as Lawrence finished the last revisions. "During the pregnancy, I want you to come here once a week, have dinner, learn about this place, about the community you're so eager to redevelop. If this child is going to be part of both worlds, you need to understand mine." George studied her for a long moment. "And if I refuse, then find someone else to give you an heir." Ava met his gaze steadily. "Those are my terms, Mr. Montgomery. Take them or leave them." The silence stretched between them, filled with the echoes of their meal, the weight of the decision they were both about to make. Finally, George reached for the pen Lawrence offered. "Once a week," he agreed, signing his name with practiced efficiency, "but I choose the nights." Ava took the pen, its weight heavy in her hand. One signature, and there would be no going back. She thought of her grandmother, of all the difficult choices that had led to this moment. Then she signed. "Well then, Mr. Montgomery," she said, pushing back from the table, "I believe we have a deal." As they prepared to leave, George paused at the door. "The gumbo," he said, not turning around. "Would it be possible, that is, next week when I come?" A smile tugged at Ava's lips despite herself. "I'll make sure there's plenty." After they left, Ava locked up and walked through her quiet restaurant. Every table, every photo, every worn floorboard held memories. She placed a hand on her flat stomach, trying to imagine the future growing inside her. "I hope you're watching, Grandma," she whispered to the empty room, "because I have a feeling things are about to get very interesting." Outside, the city hummed with its usual nighttime energy, unaware that in a small restaurant in Harlem, two lives had just become inextricably linked by a contract, a child, and a bowl of gumbo that tasted like memories. The waiting room of Dr. Elizabeth Chen's private fertility clinic screamed luxury, all chrome and leather and abstract art that probably cost more than Ava's annual revenue. She sat rigidly in one of the plush chairs, painfully aware of her simple dress among the designer outfits worn by other patients. George sat beside her, absorbed in his phone, seemingly oblivious to her discomfort. They hadn't spoken much since arriving, beyond his clipped greeting and a brief explanation of Dr. Chen's credentials. "The best fertility specialist in Manhattan," he'd said, as if that explained everything. "Mr. and Mrs. Montgomery," the receptionist called. "Miss Carter," Ava corrected automatically, catching the flash of surprise on the receptionist's face. George's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly as they followed her down a hallway lined with success stories, photos of beaming parents with their miracle babies. Dr. Chen proved to be surprisingly warm for someone who charged more per hour than most people made in a month. She was a petite woman in her 40s, with kind eyes behind designer glasses and a manner that put Ava slightly more at ease. "So, Doctor," Chen said, reviewing their file, "you're hoping to conceive quickly given your timeline. Have you already been trying naturally?" The question hung awkwardly in the air. Ava felt heat rise to her cheeks as George cleared his throat. "We're taking a medical approach from the start," he said carefully. Understanding dawned in Dr. Chen's eyes as she glanced between them. To her credit, her professional demeanor never wavered. "I see. Well, we'll need to run some tests first. Check hormone levels, discuss the procedure options, whatever gives us the highest probability of success," George interrupted. "Cost is not an issue." Dr. Chen's gaze settled on Ava. "And how do you feel about that, Ms. Carter?" The question caught Ava off guard. Since signing the contract, everything had moved so quickly. Lawyers, preliminary medical screenings, the transfer of funds to save her restaurant. She hadn't really had time to process the reality of what they were about to do. She glanced at George, who was studying a medical diagram on the wall with intense focus. "I want to make sure everything is safe, and I'd like to understand exactly what we're doing, each step." Dr. Chen smiled approvingly. "Of course. Let's start with the basics. First, we'll need to do a complete physical examination. Check your—" "Perhaps I should step out for this part," George said, already rising. "Actually," Dr. Chen's voice was gentle but firm, "I think it would be beneficial for you to stay. These decisions affect both of you, and the more you understand about each other's role in this process, the better." What followed was the most intimate conversation Ava had ever had with a virtual stranger sitting 3 feet away. Dr. Chen explained the IVF process in detail, the hormone treatments, egg retrieval, fertilization, implantation. George's eyes widened slightly at the description of the daily injections required. "You'll need support during this process," Dr. Chen emphasized. "The hormones can be challenging, both physically and emotionally. Do you have a good support system, Ms. Carter?" Ava thought of Ruby, who still didn't know about the arrangement, of her empty apartment, where she'd have to somehow manage these injections alone. "I'll manage." "I'll arrange for a nurse," George said suddenly. "Someone discreet, experienced, with IVF protocols." "That won't be necessary," Ava began. "It's not up for discussion." His tone was final. "This needs to succeed. Whatever support you need, you'll have it." The rest of the appointment passed in a blur of schedules, prescriptions, and instructions. By the time they left the clinic, Ava's head was spinning with information, and her purse was heavy with medications. "My driver can take you home," George offered as they stood on the sidewalk. "No, I need to get to the restaurant. It's our first night open since—" She trailed off, not wanting to remind him that just a week ago she'd been facing bankruptcy. Now her restaurant's accounts were flush with cash. Her staff's jobs were secure, and she was carrying a bag full of fertility drugs. The surreality of it all hit her suddenly, making her sway slightly. George's hand caught her elbow, steadying her. The touch was brief, but warm, through her thin sleeve. "You should rest," he said, frowning. "The restaurant can manage one more night without you." "No!" Ava straightened her spine. "Tonight's important. You're coming for dinner, remember? Our first weekly meeting." Something flickered in his expression. Surprise that she'd remembered, perhaps, or that she was still insisting on it after the intimacies of the morning. "I have a late meeting." "Cancel it." She met his gaze. "That was our deal, Mr. Montgomery. Once a week you learn about my world. Unless you're having second thoughts. His jaw worked for a moment before he gave a short nod. 8 o'clock? Don't be late. Grandmother Rose always said timing is everything in cooking and in life. They parted ways there. Ava to the subway, George to his waiting car. As she swayed with the familiar rhythm of the train, she found her hand straying to her stomach. Somewhere between the clinic's pristine halls and this crowded subway car, their arrangement had become real. Soon, her body would begin changing, preparing to nurture a new life. A life created not from love or passion, but from desperation and ambition. The restaurant was already busy when she arrived. Ruby took one look at her face and pulled her into a fierce hug. "You okay, baby girl? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine." Ava managed a smile. "Just, making some changes. Big ones." Ruby's eyes narrowed knowingly. Would these changes have anything to do with Mr. Fancy Suit coming for dinner tonight? "It's complicated, ain't it always?" Ruby squeezed her shoulder. "Well, whatever's going on, you know we've got your back. This place is family, and family sticks together." Family. The word echoed in Ava's mind as she changed into her chef's whites. By this time next year, she'd have a child who would be heir to the Montgomery fortune, but also part of this community, this legacy. A child who would have to bridge two very different worlds. At exactly 8 o'clock, the bell above the door chimed. George Montgomery stood there, looking only slightly less imposing in a charcoal suit without the tie. Their eyes met across the bustling dining room, and for a moment, Ava saw something like uncertainty in his expression. She gestured to the same table they'd sat at during their negotiation. It was time to begin another kind of education, teaching a man who believed everything had a price about the things in life that couldn't be bought. 6 weeks into their arrangement, Ava noticed George Montgomery had developed a routine. Every Thursday at 8, he would arrive at Carter's Soul Kitchen, loosen his tie, and settle into what had become his table, the one partially hidden by the old brick column, offering a view of both the kitchen and the street outside. He never ordered. He just waited for whatever she decided to serve him. Tonight, she watched through the kitchen window as he arrived right on schedule, but something was different. His usual precise movements were slower, his shoulders carrying an unfamiliar weight. "Your boy looks rough tonight," Ruby commented, sliding past with a tray of cornbread. After weeks of watching their Thursday ritual, her head waitress had developed an unnervingly accurate sense about their unusual relationship, though Ava still hadn't told her the full truth. "He's not my boy," Ava muttered, but she found herself adding extra honey to the glaze for his roasted chicken, his favorite, though he'd never admitted it. The hormone treatments had made her more observant, or maybe just more emotional. She noticed things now, the way George's hand sometimes shook when he was tired, how his eyes softened when he watched families dining together, the slight smile that appeared when she surprised him with a new dish. She brought out his dinner personally, as always. "Rough day?" "Victoria." He spoke the name like a curse. "She's been meeting with board members behind my back, suggesting I'm—" He trailed off, seeming to remember their unspoken agreement to keep business talk to a minimum during these dinners. "Suggesting you're what?" Ava set down his plate, the rich aroma of honey and herbs rising between them. George's lips twisted. Unstable, unreliable, making rash decisions about the company's future. His eyes met hers briefly. "She doesn't know about our arrangement, but she knows something's changed." Ava sat down across from him, another part of their routine. These conversations had become easier over the weeks, the silences less awkward. "Try the chicken," she said, "then tell me what's really bothering you." He took a bite, and she saw some of the tension leave his shoulders. "You added something different to the glaze." "Stop deflecting." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You're getting better at reading me. 6 weeks of dinner conversations will do that." She didn't mention the other intimacies they'd shared, the daily updates she sent about her hormone treatments, his unexpected appearance at her apartment one night when she'd been struggling with the injections, the way his hand had steadied hers as she held the needle. "The board meeting is tomorrow," he said finally. "Victoria's going to question my fitness to lead the company. She's been laying the groundwork for weeks, suggesting I'm making emotional rather than logical decisions." "Are you?" His fork paused halfway to his mouth. "What? Making emotional decisions?" Ava gestured around the restaurant. "You're here every week, eating soul food in Harlem instead of whatever fancy restaurants you usually frequent. You're having a baby with a woman Victoria would probably consider beneath you. Maybe she's right, maybe you are changing." "This is business," he said, but the words lacked their usual conviction. "Is it?" Ava stood, smoothing her apron. "Wait here. I have something for your meeting tomorrow." She disappeared into the kitchen, returning with a carefully packed container. "Grandmother Rose's miracle workers," she explained, setting it beside him. "Her famous cornbread muffins. She used to say they could solve any problem, mend any fence." George stared at the container. "You want me to bring soul food to a board meeting? I want you to show them that different doesn't mean wrong. That maybe what this company needs isn't more of the same old thinking." She touched the container lightly. "Sometimes the best business decisions are the ones that remember there are actual people involved." Their fingers brushed as he reached for the container, and Ava felt the now familiar flutter in her stomach. The one she blamed on hormones but suspected might be something else entirely. "I should go," she said quickly. "Early appointment tomorrow." His expression shifted. "The implantation?" "Yeah." She tried to keep her voice casual, though her heart was racing at the thought. After weeks of preparations, shots and monitoring, tomorrow they would take the final step. "Dr. Chen says everything looks perfect. The embryos are strong, and my body's ready. I'll be there," he said, surprising her. They hadn't discussed whether he would attend. The procedure itself was intimate, medical, far beyond their carefully maintained boundaries. "You don't have to—" "I'll be there," he repeated more firmly. The next morning, Ava lay on an examination table in Dr. Chen's clinic, trying to calm her racing heart. George sat in a chair near her head, his usual impeccable suit incongruous in the medical setting. He'd arrived before her, bringing coffee, and a quiet strength she hadn't expected to need. "Everything looks perfect," Dr. Chen said, reviewing the ultrasound screen. "The embryos are excellent quality. We'll transfer 2, giving you the best chance of success." "2?" George's voice carried an unfamiliar note of anxiety. "I thought we agreed on 1. "Statistics show better success rates with 2 embryos," Dr. Chen explained. "And given your timeline—" Ava reached for George's hand without thinking. He stiffened for a moment, then relaxed, his fingers wrapping around hers. They stayed that way through the procedure, connected by something more than their contract, more than their business arrangement. 2 weeks later, they sat in the same room, watching Dr. Chen study another ultrasound screen. The silence stretched like a rubber band ready to snap. "Well," Dr. Chen said finally, turning the screen toward them. "It seems both embryos took. Congratulations, you're having twins." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Ava heard George's sharp intake of breath, felt his hand tighten around hers. When had they started holding hands again? She stared at the screen, at the 2 tiny, fluttering heartbeats that would change everything. "Twins," George whispered, and in that single word, Ava heard all his careful plans crumbling. Later that night, after George had insisted on driving her home, Ava stood in her small kitchen, one hand resting on her still flat stomach. "2 of you," she murmured. Your grandmother would say, "This is what we get for trying to plan everything." So perfectly. Her phone buzzed. A text from George. "Are you okay?" She stared at the message, so different from his usual formal communications about appointments and arrangements. Before she could respond, another message appeared. "I'm not sure I know how to be a father to one child, let alone two." The admission, so vulnerable and honest, made her throat tight. She typed back, "Good thing you have those weekly dinner lessons then. Lots to learn before they arrive." His response came quickly. "Tomorrow night. Same time, same table," she confirmed. "I'll teach you about family-style dining. Seems appropriate now." She set down her phone, looking around her apartment. Too small for twins, she realized. Everything was about to change, and not in the careful, controlled way they'd planned. But maybe, she thought, remembering the look on George's face when he saw those two heartbeats, maybe unplanned changes were exactly what they both needed. Victoria Montgomery's heels clicked against the marble floors of Montgomery Tower as she strode into George's office unannounced. She carried a tablet, her red lips curved in a smile that made his instincts spark with warning. "Care to explain this?" She placed the tablet on his desk, displaying a medical bill from Dr. Chen's clinic. "The board might be interested to know you're spending company money on fertility treatments." George kept his expression neutral, though his pulse quickened. "My personal medical expenses are none of the board's concern." "Personal?" Victoria's laugh was sharp. "Nothing about you is personal, George, not when you're the face of this company." She perched on the edge of his desk, a move she'd probably practiced for maximum effect. "Who is she?" "That's none of your business." "Oh, but it is. Everything about this company is my business." She stood, smoothing her designer skirt. "You know what the funny thing is? Every Thursday night you disappear. No meetings, no calls. And coincidentally, there's a certain restaurant in Harlem that's suddenly flush with cash after nearly facing foreclosure." George's hand tightened on his pen. "Are you having me followed?" "I'm protecting this company's interests." Victoria's smile turned predatory. "What would the board say if they knew you were consorting with some cook from Harlem?" "Get out." George's voice was deadly quiet. "Or what? You'll fire me? Good luck explaining that to the board when I tell them about your little arrangement." She headed for the door, then paused. "Oh, and George, twins, how complicated. I do hope nothing goes wrong with the pregnancy. Such delicate things. Pregnancies." The threat in her voice made his blood run cold. As soon as she left, he grabbed his phone, dialing Ava's number with shaking fingers. "George?" Her voice was surprised. He never called during the day. "Is everything okay? Where are you?" "At the restaurant. We're testing new recipes for..." "Stay there. I'm coming to get you." "What? George, what's wrong?" "Victoria knows." He was already heading for the elevator, his security team falling into step behind him. About everything, the clinic, the restaurant, the twins. The silence on the other end made his chest tight. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, he said. "Don't leave with anyone. Don't talk to anyone you don't know." "George, you're scaring me." He softened his voice with effort. "Just trust me, please." The drive to Harlem was tense, his mind racing with contingency plans. Victoria's threat played on repeat in his head. He'd seen what she was capable of, the calculated destruction, the perfectly orchestrated accidents that couldn't be traced back to her. Ava was waiting outside the restaurant, her face tight with worry. Ruby stood beside her, arms crossed, looking ready to fight whoever had upset her girl. The sight of them, Ava's hand resting protectively over her still flat stomach, Ruby's fierce guardianship, made something shift in George's chest. "Get in," he said, opening the car door. "Both of you." "Both?" Ruby's eyebrows shot up. "You're family to her," George said simply. "That makes you part of this." The drive to his penthouse was filled with explanations about the contract, the pregnancy, Victoria's threats. Ruby's expression shifted from shock to understanding to protective anger. "That witch," she muttered when he finished. "Threatening babies. Who does that?" "Someone who stands to lose millions if those babies are born," Ava said quietly. She hadn't spoken much during the drive, her face turned toward the window. George's penthouse occupied the top 2 floors of an exclusive building, with security that rivaled most government buildings. As they rode up in the private elevator, he found himself seeing it through their eyes, the cold minimalism, the obvious wealth, the utter lack of anything personal. "You live here?" Ruby's voice dripped with judgment. "Baby girl, you better make this man buy some actual furniture before these babies come." "No one's moving in," Ava started to say, but George cut her off. "Actually, that's exactly what needs to happen." He turned to face her. "Victoria won't stop. She's already having you followed. The only way I can guarantee your safety, all of your safety, is if you're here under my protection. I can't leave the restaurant. You can run it remotely. We'll set up cameras, daily video calls with the staff. Ruby can oversee things in person." He looked at Ruby. "With a significant raise, of course," Ruby snorted. "You think you can buy my approval with money?" "No," George said honestly, "but I can try to earn it by keeping them safe." Something in his tone made both women look at him sharply. "This isn't just about the contract anymore, is it?" Ava asked softly. Before he could answer, his phone buzzed, a news alert. His hands shook slightly as he read it. "What is it?" Ava moved closer, her warmth seeping through his suit jacket. "Victoria just called an emergency board meeting. She's presenting evidence that I'm mentally unfit to lead the company." He looked up, meeting Ava's eyes. "Tomorrow morning." "Those muffins still in your office?" Ava asked. "What?" "Grandmother Rose's miracle workers, the ones I gave you for the board meeting." "Yes, but—" "Good." She squared her shoulders. "Then we have work to do. Ruby, call Antonio. Tell him he's in charge of dinner service tonight. We're going to need the kitchen here." George blinked. "What are you planning?" "You're going to that board meeting tomorrow," Ava said, already moving toward his pristine, never-used kitchen. "But you're not going alone, and you're not going with just muffins. We're going to show Victoria and that board exactly what they're up against." "We?" The word felt strange in his mouth, warm and unfamiliar. "Yes, we." She turned back to him, her eyes fierce. "She threatened our children, George. All of our children. The twins and my restaurant family. I'm done playing defense." Ruby was already on the phone with Antonio, and Ava was opening cupboards, muttering about inadequate equipment. The scent of her perfume mingled with her natural warmth as she brushed past him, making his head spin. "I don't remember this being part of our contract," he said weakly. Ava paused, her hand on his arm. "Neither were twins or Thursday night dinners. Or the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching." His heart stuttered. "Ava, later," she said firmly. "Right now, we have a board to win over and a witch to defeat. Grandmother Rose always said the best revenge is living well, and feeding your enemies food so good they can't help but swallow their pride along with it." As George watched Ava and Ruby transform his sterile kitchen into a warm, bustling command center, he realized something that should have terrified him, but instead felt like coming home. His life would never be the same. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly what he needed. The Montgomery Holdings boardroom buzzed with tension on Friday morning. 12 board members sat around the massive mahogany table, picking at the breakfast spread Ava had spent half the night preparing. Fresh biscuits with honey butter, individual quiches, and of course, Grandmother Rose's cornbread muffins. George watched them eat, noting how even Victoria couldn't quite hide her appreciation of the food. "Now that we're all here," Victoria said, rising gracefully, I've called this emergency meeting to address some serious concerns about the company's leadership. She gestured to her assistant, who began distributing folders. Over the past few months, George Montgomery has exhibited increasingly erratic behavior. George felt Ava shift beside him. They'd discussed her presence extensively the night before, the risk of exposing their arrangement versus the power of facing Victoria together. In the end, Ava had insisted. "She needs to see she can't intimidate us," she'd said, and George had found himself unable to argue. Victoria's perfectly manicured nail tapped against her folder. Unexplained absences every Thursday night, massive transfers of funds to a failing restaurant in Harlem, secret medical procedures. Her gaze fixed on Ava. "And now, I believe we've discovered why." Screens descended from the ceiling, displaying surveillance photos. George entering Carter's Soul Kitchen, Ava at Dr. Chen's clinic, the two of them in his car. "George has been carrying on a relationship with this woman," Victoria's lip curled slightly, "while making business decisions that benefit her financially. Classic manipulation. She's clearly after the Montgomery fortune." Before George could speak, Ava stood. The simple elegance of her dark blue dress, borrowed from his personal shopper's collection, made her look every bit as polished as Victoria. "My name is Ava Carter," she said, her voice clear and strong. "And yes, George and I have an arrangement, but not the kind you're implying." Murmurs rippled through the board members as Ava continued. "That failing restaurant you mentioned, it's been in my family for 30 years. It's fed generations of families, provided jobs, been a cornerstone of its community. When banks refused to help despite our proven track record, George saw an opportunity not just to save a business, but to show that Montgomery Holdings could be more than just another soulless corporation." "This is absurd," Victoria cut in. "She's clearly—" "I'm not finished." Ava's tone made even Victoria pause. "You've all been eating my grandmother's recipes this morning. Tell me, does that taste like the work of someone interested only in money? George's investment in Carter's Soul Kitchen isn't just about profit. It's about understanding that real success comes from building community, not destroying it." George watched the board members' faces, seeing uncertainty replace suspicion. Franklin Chen, their oldest member, was actually licking honey butter from his fingers. "A touching story," Victoria recovered, "but it doesn't explain the medical bills, the secret appointments." "I'm pregnant," Ava said simply. "With twins." The silence was deafening. "George and I have a legal arrangement regarding the children. Everything is documented, everything is above board." She touched her stomach lightly. "These babies weren't conceived in some scandalous affair. They're the result of a carefully planned agreement between two consenting adults." Victoria's face had gone pale. "You expect us to believe—" "It's true." George finally stood, moving to Ava's side. "Victoria knows it's true because she's had us followed, had our medical records stolen, all in an attempt to force me out." He met each board member's eyes. "Yes, I've been making changes. Yes, I've been doing things differently than my grandfather would have, because I've learned something these past few months, something I should have known all along." His hand found Ava's, drawing strength from her warmth. "Business isn't just about profits and power. It's about people, communities, legacies. The kind of legacy I want to leave for my children isn't just financial. It's moral, ethical, human." Franklin Chen cleared his throat. "These muffins," he said, holding up one of Grandmother Rose's miracle workers, "remind me of the ones my mother used to make, before our neighborhood was redeveloped and her restaurant had to close." His gaze settled on Victoria. "Tell me, Mrs. Montgomery, what exactly is your plan for the company's future?" Victoria's composure cracked slightly. We would continue with our current development strategies." "Destroying more communities?" Ava asked softly. "Erasing more family businesses, more memories?" "Progress requires sacrifice," Victoria snapped. "No," George said. "Progress requires vision. The vision to see that preserving community culture and achieving business success aren't mutually exclusive." He reached into his briefcase, pulling out a new set of folders. "Inside, you'll find my proposal for a revised approach to urban development, one that incorporates local businesses, provides support for existing community institutions, and creates sustainable growth that benefits everyone, not just our shareholders." The board members began reading, their expressions shifting from skepticism to interest. Even Victoria seemed thrown off balance by this unexpected move. "You've been busy on those Thursday nights," Franklin Chen observed, a knowing smile playing at his lips. "Yes," George admitted, glancing at Ava. "I've been getting an education in what really matters." Victoria made one last attempt. "This is all very touching. But the fact remains, he's having children with an employee, essentially paying for—" "Actually," Lawrence spoke up from his corner, "Ms. Carter is not an employee. She's an independent business owner and partner in our new community development initiative. And as for the children," he smiled slightly, "the arrangement is not unlike the one you had with George's grandfather, is it? Except in this case, everything is legal, documented, and ethically transparent." Victoria's face went from pale to red. "How dare you?" "I think we've heard enough," Franklin Chen said, standing. "I move for an immediate vote on Victoria Montgomery's continued role with the company." "Seconded," came multiple voices. What followed was the corporate equivalent of a guillotine. Swift, decisive, and final. Within 30 minutes, Victoria was escorted from the building, her access cards deactivated, her influence severed. But it wasn't until they were alone, in George's office, that the full weight of what had happened hit them. Ava sank into one of his leather chairs, suddenly exhausted. "I can't believe we did that." "We?" George's voice was strange, making her look up. He was staring at her with an expression she'd never seen before, something raw and vulnerable and terrifyingly close to what she'd been trying not to feel herself. "Ava," he said softly, "what are we doing?" "Following the contract," she answered automatically. But the words felt hollow. "The contract didn't include you defending me to the board. It didn't include weekly dinners where you teach me about life. It didn't include—" He gestured helplessly. "This, whatever this is becoming." Her heart thundered in her chest. "George," his phone buzzed. A text from Victoria. "Enjoy your little victory. But remember, I know things about your precious Ava that would break your heart. If I can't have the company, maybe I'll just share those secrets instead." George's face hardened as he read the message. Ava saw the walls slamming back into place, felt him withdrawing even as he stood right in front of her. "George," she reached for him, but he stepped back. We should keep things professional from now on," he said, his voice distant. "It's safer that way." Safer for whom? But he was already turning away, retreating behind his desk, behind his armor of business and control. Ava stood, one hand pressed to her stomach where their children grew, watching the man she'd come to care for disappear behind the mask of George Montgomery, CEO. She left his office without another word, but her grandmother's voice whispered in her mind, "Sometimes, baby, girl, the biggest risk isn't in loving someone. It's in letting fear stop you from loving at all." As the elevator descended, Ava made a decision. Victoria might have secrets, might have threats, but Ava had something stronger. Truth. And it was time for both her and George to face it, whatever the cost. 3 weeks had passed since the board meeting, and George hadn't come to his Thursday dinner. Ava stood in Carter's Soul Kitchen's empty dining room, one hand resting on her now visible baby bump, staring at his vacant table. The morning sickness had finally passed, but a different kind of nausea had taken its place, the ache of absence, of words left unsaid. He'll come around, Ruby said, setting up for the evening service. Men like that, they're scared of feelings, scared of anything they can't control with money or contracts. Maybe, Ava said softly, but these babies aren't waiting. And I'm done waiting too. She'd spent the past weeks running her restaurant, attending doctor's appointments alone, and trying to understand Victoria's final threat. What secrets could she possibly have? Ava had lived her life openly, honestly. The only secrets she had were... The realization hit her like a thunderbolt. "Ruby," she said suddenly, "watch the restaurant. I need to see someone." An hour later, Ava sat in Dr. Chen's office, her heart pounding. "I need to know," she said. "The genetic screening we did before the IVF, what exactly did it show?" Dr. Chen's kind eyes held understanding. "You're worried about Victoria Montgomery. She said she had secrets about me, things that would make George..." Ava swallowed hard. "Things that would break his heart." "Ah," Dr. Chen pulled out a file. "You're referring to the genetic marker we found. The one that indicates a higher risk of the condition your mother had." Ava nodded, her throat tight. Her mother's heart condition had taken her when Ava was just a child. The genetic screening had shown Ava carried the same marker, not a guarantee she'd develop the condition, but a risk she'd chosen not to share with George. "Does Victoria have access to my medical records?" "No," Dr. Chen said firmly, "but she has sources everywhere. It's possible she found out." Ava stood, her decision made. "Thank you, Dr. Chen." "Where are you going?" "To tell him myself, before Victoria can use it against us." The drive to Montgomery Tower felt both longer and shorter than usual. In the elevator, Ava caught her reflection in the polished doors. Her simple chef's whites, her small baby bump, her grandmother's determination in her eyes. George's assistant tried to stop her, but Ava walked past her desk with the confidence of someone who belonged there. She opened his office door without knocking. He looked up from his computer, his face showing surprise and something else. Hunger, maybe. Like a man who'd been starving himself. "Ava, I have a genetic heart condition," she said before he could speak. "Or rather, I might develop one, like my mother did. That's Victoria's secret, the thing she thinks will drive you away. Because a defective heir isn't what you bargained for, is it?" George stood slowly. "How long have you known?" "Since the genetic screening. I didn't tell you because..." She laughed shakily. "Because it was business, right? Just a contract. Except it hasn't been just business for a while now, has it?" "Ava," his voice was rough, "why are you here?" "Because it's Thursday." She moved closer to his desk. "Because for months now you've spent every Thursday letting me teach you about family, about community, about what really matters. And somehow, along the way, you taught me something too." "What's that?" He was around the desk now, close enough that she could see the tiredness in his eyes, the way his hands trembled slightly. "That sometimes the best things in life can't be negotiated, contracted, or controlled. They just happen, like falling in love with the cold, ruthless businessman who turns out to have the warmest heart I've ever known." George's breath caught. "Love? Yes, you idiot." Ava felt tears threatening but pushed on. "I love you, not your money, not your position, just you. The man who remembers how I take my prenatal vitamins, who holds my hand during ultrasounds, who lights up every time he feels the baby's kick. The man who's so scared of turning into his father that he's willing to give up his chance at happiness. I'm not..." he started, but she cut him off. "Your father abandoned your mother when she got sick. I know that's what you're afraid of, that the same thing could happen with me. But George, you're not him. You've proven that every Thursday night for months. If something happened to you..." His voice broke. "The babies would have an amazing father, one who knows the value of family, of love, of building something that matters." She took his hand, placing it on her stomach where they're children. "Grew. Feel that. That's not business, that's not a contract, that's love, pure and simple. As if on cue, one of the twins kicked against his palm. George's eyes widened, and something in him finally broke open. "I love you," he whispered, like a confession. "God help me, I've loved you since that first night you made me try your grandmother's gumbo. I didn't know how to—" "I know." She smiled through her tears. "Grandmother Rose would say you needed time to simmer, like all the best. Recipes?" He laughed, a real laugh that transformed his entire face. Then he was kissing her, and it wasn't like any business transaction she'd ever known. It was warm and real and tasted like coming home. When they finally parted, he rested his forehead against hers. "Move in with me," he said, "not because of Victoria, not because of the babies, because I want to wake up to you every morning, because I want to learn how to make your grandmother's recipes in our kitchen, because I love you. On one condition," Ava said, and his eyes crinkled with amusement at her businesslike tone. "Name it. We renovate that sterile penthouse of yours, make it a real home, with color and life, and a kitchen worthy of teaching our children their great-grandmother's recipes. Done!" He kissed her again, softer this time. "Any other conditions?" "Just one more." She smiled against his lips. "You're still coming to Thursday night dinners. Some traditions shouldn't be negotiated." 6 months later, Ava stood in their newly renovated kitchen, watching George attempt to teach their twin boys, all of 3 hours old and sleeping peacefully in their bassinets, the secret to Grandmother Rose's cornbread. His voice was soft as he explained each step, even though they were far too young to understand. The kitchen was warm with afternoon sunlight, the walls painted in the same rich colors as Carter's soul kitchen. Photos lined the shelves. Rose, Carter in her restaurant, George and Ava at their small private wedding, the ultrasound showing their boys, their combined families and communities celebrating together. Ruby appeared in the doorway, smiling at the scene. "Your grandmother would be proud, baby girl, of all of this." Ava watched her husband carefully swaddle their sons, Elijah Rose and Noah Carter Montgomery, and knew it was true. They'd built something her grandmother would have understood perfectly. A family blended from love and strength, tradition and progress, soul food and skyscrapers. "Hey," George called softly, looking up from the babies. "Think they're ready for their first Thursday night dinner?" Ava joined her family, letting George's arm slip around her waist. "Almost," she said, "but first their daddy needs to learn the most important recipe of all." "Which is?" She kissed him softly. "How to make love last forever. Lucky for you, I learned from the best. Grandmother Rose always said it's like making her famous gumbo. Start with a strong base, add plenty of heart, and never ever be afraid to spice things up." George laughed, the sound echoing through their home, their real home, filled with love and life and the promise of many more Thursday night dinners to come. Outside, the city hummed with its usual energy, but inside their kitchen, time seemed to slow, measured now not in business quarters or contract terms, but in moments of joy, in shared meals, in the quiet breathing of their sleeping sons, in the beautiful, unplanned miracle of falling in love. The end. That was a beautiful story, wasn't it? I hope you enjoyed it. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Your collaboration is very important to me.